Hello and welcome to the B2B Insights podcast. I'm Conor Wilcock. I'm Managing Director of B2B International, and I'm joined today by Simi Dhawan, who's Senior Research Director, for a really important discussion on the challenges that marketers face when targeting B2B buyers and some of the things that they can think about in order to overcome those challenges. We think that that's particularly important for B2B companies who need to engage a really varied customer base with often complex needs, while at the same time balancing those ever tightening marketing budgets. So in this episode, we're going to explore that challenge alongside delving into segmentation as a key topic, which we feel is an important opportunity for effectively targeting those B2B customers. So Simi, it's great to have you on.
Thanks, Conor, and good to see I'm not the only one donning a big headset. So good to see that you're joining me in air traffic control, amongst other things, isn't it?
We are trendsetters, if nothing else, Simi. So I guess before we start talking about segmentation and the practicalities of doing that, I think if we just go back to first principles really and talk about the main challenges that marketers need to keep in mind based on your experience, what do you think those main challenges are?
Yeah, I think you touched upon it earlier in talking about the fact that we've seen marketing budgets becoming tighter. We've certainly seen that since the pandemic, but that seems to be a trend that we expect to continue moving forward. So there is that kind of onus on us to work with clients and drive efficiencies as best we can. And I suppose adding to that challenge is also the fact that, as we'll talk about, I expect in more detail today, is just the fact that customer needs are growing more complex. We're seeing those buying units again becoming more complex, more decision makers involved, and then add to the mix that you've got more brands being considered and a more competitive landscape as well. Then you can see clearly why it's really important that B2B brands really work hard to stand out from the crowd.
I totally agree. I think that's been my experience too. And you're right that the data from our superpowers study this year certainly backs that up. We've been talking about this sea of sameness that B2B brands are really struggling to cut through the noise at the moment, and that buyers are telling us that they're not seeing as much differentiation between brands as they used to. That's obviously having an impact on buying behavior as well. So what are you seeing through the superpowers data to sort of back that point up?
Yeah, I mean, with the superpowers side of things, we've been running that tracker since 2021. So the beauty of that is we've got quite a large data set now to look at that kind of year on year trend. And one of the kind of standout trends that we've noticed is this growing buying unit as part of the purchasing process. So every year that seems to be growing. On average now, from the data, we see that there's an average of 7 people involved at different levels. So that's 7 individuals that we're needing to engage, build trust with, understand their needs and expectations. And it could be more than that. That's just the average. I was speaking to a client yesterday talking about the fact that for them, it's around 9 people involved. So there's obviously lots to think about there that poses a challenge to B2B marketers. And also, again, the fact that they are considering more brands in the mix as well now than ever before is a big one. So, it is more competitive. There's more people to serve and understand. And so I think all of that adds to that challenge and that complexity, which of course is backed by our superpowers findings.
I agree, Simi, and I think another data point that really stood out to me was the fact that this year the incumbency advantage is being eroded more than ever. So I think it was about a third of buying experiences where the incumbent did not win the business. So it seems to be a challenge that's becoming more and more acute, more and more salient. And we hear it outside of the research that we do. We hear it from clients. We hear it from other people in the marketing industry that marketers in the B2B world are having to work harder and harder and harder than ever in order to win against the competition. By the way, just as we're talking about superpowers, just to call back to a previous episode in the summer, if anyone wants to go back and listen to learn more information about the study, the superpowers research, then they can certainly do that. But yeah, as we say, this trend of marketers having to work so much harder. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that challenge.
Yeah, I mean, actually, that fact about incumbents was staggering to think it's a third. And we know in B2B, there's a huge level of inertia, at least in certain industries, to kind of shy away from what's been tried and tested and try something new. So that was interesting. And dare I say it again, this is backed within the data, but there is a sense that B2B marketers potentially feel they're doing a better job of marketing a distinct brand position, communicating a clear USP than possibly in practice, because of course, as part of the superpowers, there's a subset of B2B buyers that we also speak to. And so on the flip side, they were saying the complete opposite, that actually they're hearing from lots of different B2B brands, but they all sound and act the same. So there's definitely, it's definitely feeling like a more level playing field. I suppose then the big question is, what is it they need to do to really stand out from the crowd and communicate more effectively to their target audience?
I mean, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? And I guess we've spent the first few minutes of this episode talking about this like hellscape of B2B for marketers. It's just completely difficult. There's no differentiation. So maybe we should pivot now to talking about what the opportunity is, I guess, to stand in the crowd. And what we're seeing is really this power of personalizing experiences to the needs of those individual buyers. And we can't forget, as you mentioned earlier, that the buying group is getting bigger and bigger. So when we talk about personalizing experiences, we're not talking about the experience of the company that you're trying to sell to. We're talking about the quite diverse experiences of each of the individual members of that buying committee. So on one hand, I suppose it makes sense for marketers to place focus on the aggregate needs of the organization, but we are finding that the needs of the individual really, really important, especially, as you say, given that buying group is getting bigger and bigger. And again, we're not just talking about, I think one of the pitfalls that B2B brands often fall into is to think about the most senior person that they need to speak to. So, okay, well, we just need to know what CFOs think, or we just need to know what the CEO or the managing director thinks. And while that's very important, of course, those people are often signing the contracts, they're very influential. We also need to be able to think about the entire tree of decision makers, from very senior board level all the way through to middle management. And some of those junior roles are often incredibly influential because they're often the ones that are given the task of starting the journey, providing that short list of brands. And so if you're not cutting through to those first stage junior decision makers and influencers, then you might not even be in the door to speak to the more senior stakeholders at the end. So I think the key for marketers is to make sure that they demonstrate that they understand not just the high level, the strategic, but the day-to-day working world and those challenges of those individual buyers. They really need to show that they're willing to tailor their offering in order to fit those needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we've seen is that, and isn't to say there's a big mass of B2B brands doing this already, but certainly those brands that are able to kind of deliver that more personalized marketing approach or that more personalized experience to different subsets of buying groups and their customers really do reap the benefits. I was actually reading something interesting on LinkedIn the other day that talked about the fact that if we cast our minds back even to a few years, that people were happier to part with more personal information in return for more personalized marketers content. So very happy to part with personal information previously. But obviously, as we've seen as of late and with legislation, there's a growing concern about data privacy. And that's a real concern. And I think that more so than before, B2B buyers probably are less inclined to want to part with that information and be bombarded with information, at least ahead of doing day-to-day business with a particular B2B brand. So I suppose that adds another challenge into the mix. I mean, what would you say to marketers facing that sort of challenge?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, and I agree. I thought that that article was very interesting. We'll perhaps leave a link to it in the episode notes. I think brands. I think it is possible for brands to have a human face and to offer those more tailored experiences without necessarily expecting customers to part ways with their personal information up front. I mean, one effective way to do that, I think, is through customer segmentation. And we know that with that approach, marketers can show that they better understand, they can develop a better understanding of the diverse range of needs that their customers have, and to use that insight to replace what might have previously been a one-size-fits-all marketing strategy into one that's much more tailored, but also agile, able to evolve more easily and more quickly as well. And that's really one of the key advantages of a well-run segmentation, is that it enables B2B marketers to group customers into similar or like segments because, for example, they have similar needs, they have similar behaviors, mindset, attitudes, or, as we often recommend to our clients, a combination of all of those things. That's really where you see the most sophisticated B2B segmentations. By the way, we're saying this as if it's really easy. We know that it's not to implement, and we'll perhaps come on to that later on, but what it means, in theory at least, is that you can create much more targeted value propositions and messaging for each segment that you want to serve, while also identifying the segments that are perhaps less important or should be lower down the priority list for you. Because all of this, of course, comes down to resourcing and creating efficiencies. In an ideal world, if you had 10,000 customers, you would have 10,000 segments, right? But it's not possible for well, I certainly have never met a B2B business that can do marketing in that way. So we need to try and play the odds as best we can and find that right balance between tailoring our messaging and having more individualized value propositions, while taking care not to overstretch our marketing resource and our marketing budget. So all of this really helps to drive those efficiencies, which we think can only be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're in the business of business to business, but what we've been talking about here is the fact that, there are so many more people to serve behind the scenes, and obviously as individuals we are influenced, and our expectations are set but by what happens in both our personal and our working lives. So it makes sense to kind of look at that personalization at play in a range of brands. And if we look at some everyday brands, Netflix is a brilliant example of a brand in personal life that is really driving that personalization. At the moment, they look at user data, they gather user data on what people have watched and rated, and they use that to kind of customize their recommendations on personalized content for those individuals. So that's a really, really good example there. And I suppose when thinking about B2B, again, there's likely fewer examples out there, but that's not to say that there aren't brands leading the fore on this. And there were a few that kind of came through as doing this particularly well and successfully, again, through our superpowers. And one of those brands was HP. And you only need to do an internet search and you can see that they've actually been running a number of successful account-based marketing campaigns. They work with partners such as LinkedIn and others to do this. And what's great is they're sort of marrying up both their sales and marketing teams, empowering them with insights, really getting closer to their customers, understanding their needs and expectations, but also engaging with them more on a functional as well as an emotional level. So some really, really good stuff happening there. I suppose, so a big topic of today is looking at segmentation and how to drive some of that personalization. And it probably makes sense, especially for listeners considering a strategy and approach like this, to think about both sides, like in terms of what are the benefits, also what are some of the things to consider or the pitfalls. So probably makes sense to look at both of those in detail. So I suppose given you mentioned earlier segmentation, obviously how that can deliver value in practice, what would you say are some of the key benefits of running a successful segmentation strategy?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if I go back to my previous point about I guess if we think of it as a spectrum, right? So one end of the spectrum is to treat all customers exactly the same. So you've got one segment covering your entire organization, and then the other end of that spectrum is you have a segment for every single customer, right? And our aim will be to try and find that point in the middle, which enables us to extract much more value from our customer base and from the market in general to gain a competitive advantage without overexerting ourselves or just setting ourselves up for failure. So if you take the first point, the risk there is that that you end up producing far too generalist a proposition for the market that simply isn't going to cut through. So your marketing communications is not going to be strong enough, sophisticated enough, relevant enough to the market. Your sales strategy, as you say, we're not just talking about marketing here. We're talking about the link up between marketing and sales. That can suffer because we're not demonstrating a tailored enough approach that we know B2B businesses and the buyers really value. Going all the way to the other end of the spectrum there, in a perfect world, we could argue, well, every customer is slightly different. They look slightly different. They behave slightly differently. So we should be treating each customer as its own segment. But as we've just discussed, that's impractical. It's inefficient to deliver in practice. It sounds great on a piece of paper, but it's impossible to put into practice. So we need that middle ground. And segmentation is exactly, we would argue, that compromise. It's a tailored approach to marketing rather than a one size fits all. It enables us to deliver more personalized experiences, and those ultimately can drive commercial benefits. And I think perhaps we talk about those commercial benefits in a second, but just before we get there, I think it's worth noting here that if there is anybody listening to this who works for an organization that has never done segmentation before, and you feel as though you're way behind the curve, trust us, you're not, because what we find is that actually relatively few B2B companies do segmentation, or at least relatively few do it really well. We found from our proprietary research that something like 5% of B2B buying experiences bear the hallmarks of effective segmentation being used to deliver scalable ABM or ABX strategies. So it's actually quite rare in the B2B space for this to be done properly. And again, I don't wish to say that as if B2B brands are going to be setting themselves up for failure. It's more to say what a great opportunity this is, because if you can do it and you can do it well and you can get the right resources behind it, then you really are going to be carving out somewhat of a competitive advantage for your brand. So again, I guess coming back then to the commercial benefits of doing this and doing it well, I guess we've observed that those B2B businesses, in those rare cases where they are successful, they enjoy winning in high value contracts. So they're increasing customer lifetime value. They're also winning deals a lot more quickly, which we know is a problem for B2B at the moment, is that the decision making process is contracted and getting much longer. So they're shortening the sales cycles. They're also creating higher levels of advocacy and loyalty from their customers as well. So your NPS is going to go up. But as we've just said, only 5% of experiences are bearing those hallmarks. So there's a massive opportunity to step ahead of the competition. I'm going to come back to you though, Simi. You mentioned risk versus reward earlier. So while there are clear benefits to segmentation, what would you say are some of the key pitfalls or risks to be aware of?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I would say it's good to start with the end in mind in whatever you're doing. Segmentation is no exception. I think if, for example, your end goal is to better understand your existing customer base, or to understand, how to build loyalty, as you said, it's one of the benefits, or grow sales, or understand which customer segments you are best placed to serve, or which might be more difficult to serve and drain resource, then it's going to make sense to look at a customer segmentation. And basically all that means is you can rely on your existing customer data, existing CRM, gather insight from existing customers, and that's going to be able to answer those sorts of objectives. If you're wanting to take that a little bit further, and for example, your main end goal is to grow market share or build brand awareness in different markets, for example, better understand prospective customers, then it's going to be more important to design something that's a market segmentation, which may involve speaking to some customers, but you're going to be including some prospects in there. So I think the design of the project can vary. So it's very important to understand what it is you're wanting to get out of the research, and obviously that has implications for the investment as well that's required. I think beyond thinking about the design, there's probably some common pitfalls across any segmentation study. So it might sound obvious, but just making sure, and you touched upon it earlier in terms of that middle ground, but just getting the right number of segments. I think, of course, we can't treat every customer as much as that would be brilliant as a segment of one. But in the same vein, we don't want to have too many segments. It's just going to create a really difficult task to try and, well, firstly, get our head around all of those segments and serve those segments. And actually, some of them might be really, really niche. So, we don't want too many segments. Equally, on the flip side, we don't want too few, because that sort of defeats the object of this personalization that we're wanting to achieve. And we could have very broad categories that aren't really allowing us to create meaningful value propositions or messages. So there is a sweet spot. And when we start a study, we don't know what the segmentation is going to look like. But again, we work with our stats team, we plug in the data, and we have a look at what those optimum segments look like. And typically that sweet spot, it varies, but it's typically within 3 to 6 segments. So again, something really, really important to be mindful of in the outputs. I'd say beyond that, the only other thing is, again, talking to the end in mind and what we want to achieve from the segmentation study is thinking about how it's going to be used. So if we're looking at, exclusively understanding how we can tailor value propositions or tailor marketing, then it might make more sense to do a needs-based segmentation that's where the segments are driven by unique customer needs. Each segment has a very different driving need. One might be more driven by innovation, one set of customers might be more price focused, and so on. And again, if you want to take that in a different direction and you're not wanting to just understand needs, but you perhaps, I don't know, if you're a B2B organization that has, say, 2,000 customers and as part of the research we speak to, say, 10% of those, then you might want to say, well, how do we segment the rest of the customer base? How do we extrapolate the findings? And again, that's where you might want to build in some more tangible firmographic information into that segmentation so you can better classify customers after the research, such as sector, size, and so on. So there's various things to consider. As you can imagine, a lot of it comes to thinking about the design of the study and ultimately what you want to get out of it and how you want to use the findings.
I'm really glad you said that, Simi, because I think that one of the reasons why B2B organizations can feel overwhelmed by the thought of doing a segmentation is that it often sits in a textbook. And so we're talking about the theory there, but I think what you've just talked about there is some of the practical tips to making sure segmentation is a success when you actually go and do it. And that can be a bit of a leap for B2B brands, is to say, okay, we've read about it, we think we know this is what we want to do, but how do we actually just open the door and walk through it? And you're right that project design is really key to that, and it has to be led. Those conversations around project design have to be led by what the ultimately required outputs are, because there isn't just one way of doing segmentation. There's lots of factors to consider. We need to think, for example, about whether we're after some sort of robust quantitative measurement to allocate segments, or whether we want a richer, deeper, more qualitative understanding of the segments, or a mixture of both, as often is the case in B2B.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've seen that. I mean, we've talked actually about the stats side of things and quantitative segmentation, but there also seems to be more qualitative research that's coming into the fold in terms of mixed method approaches. Seems to be more of an interest in creating personas, which makes sense. Just bringing those segments to life in a more engaging way. I mean, I suppose that's one of the trends we're starting to see. What sort of trends would you say marketers should look out for, or have you seen in terms of segmentation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think segmentation is changing and evolving in terms of how B2B businesses are using it. I think that's that's often a bit of a misnomer in B2B and maybe in B2B research, right? That we cross these thresholds and think, okay, now we can do customer journey mapping in B2B, or now we can do scalable customer experience research in B2B. And then it just sort of sits there and never changes. Whereas in reality, segmentation and CX and customer journey mapping, they're always evolving. The way that we do segmentation now with our clients is quite different than how we did it 5 years ago, or certainly 10 years ago. I think, for example, traditionally, we would have placed more emphasis on segmentation to group different customers. But as you mentioned, there's now this added layer in terms of persona development, which takes things further by really bringing that segmentation to life so that marketers can target those sort of fictionalized buyers based on those similar characteristics and behaviors. I mean, persona development really helps B2B teams to identify more clearly those segments so that they're sort of less abstract and more relatable. And that's not only helpful for externalizing the use of segmentation, i.e. using it with customers, but it's also really useful internally to get buy-in and to motivate people within the business, whether they be other salespeople or marketing people, whoever it might be, to properly understand what we're going after here. Is much easier for human beings to understand something that looks like a human being rather than something like that looks like it's been churned out from an Excel spreadsheet. So that's one trend. And I think another one that really springs to mind is that there seems to be a growing amount of interest in our clients wanting to integrate their internal data with research data from a segmentation project. And I think that's really useful because it speaks, first of all, to a real desire to take action and to put the segmentation to work. Having that data and that mixture of internal and external fresh primary research data to really empower and personalize that marketing that we've discussed earlier. I think that's a key way in which businesses can stand out from the crowd. Now, the challenge, or part of the challenge on that, is how to handle all of that data. And that's something that we can help with, but we're seeing more and more of it from the clients with whom we do segmentation research, is this desire to pull in that CRM data so that they can attach it to their existing customer base a lot more easily.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit on something really poignant there, which is that for a segmentation to be successful, it has to be actionable. And if it's not, well, it's soul destroying for us and less value for our clients, because, you can create the segmentation, but then it's an interesting insight rather than something that they can actually use and action. And I think to your point there about marrying up data from the survey versus client data, which we're seeing more and more adds so much value. I think that's where so far our in-house stats team really kind of, do some brilliant work there to help our clients kind of bridge the gap between those two bits of data. I mean, we've created custom tools that help our clients do exactly what we've been talking about earlier in terms of being able to allocate segments after the research. So being able to, for example, have a bunch of what we call killer questions that they can ask to other customers outside of the survey, or even prospective customers, which will allocate them to a particular segment. So tools like that, again, are really useful in empowering our clients to take action. I think on your point about persona development and really bringing those to life, I think this is where it's great to work with our clients using our in-house design team. Our whole creative offering within Dentsu as well talks to that. But we've done lots of stuff, and it's really interesting. It really does help to land the segmentation and cascade the findings a lot more easily internally. We've done all sorts of fun things. We've had actors come in and play out a day in the life of a particular segment. We've had digital platforms they can log into. Ultimately, we want internal stakeholders within our clients' businesses to say, right, I recognize X, Y, and Z of my clients within this segment. They've got to really immerse themselves in understanding those in order to action them ultimately.
Thanks, Simi. I completely agree, and I must say that some of the outputs that we've seen on segmentation projects recently are definitely among the more creative. I think it's important to step outside the box and just think about, well, what would be the best way for my organization to to truly get to know these segments and to start thinking of them just in their day to day. You almost want it to become water cooler conversation about what would this segment think or what would this persona think, because once you do that, then it is embedded and it becomes more habitual, and then you'll see that coming across in not just your marketing but in the way that you deliver customer experience on a day-to-day basis. So definitely watch this space on upcoming projects, because we're always thinking about new and creative ways to bring those segmentations to life. Well, thank you again, Simi. This has been a really interesting discussion, and thanks for those listening. If you've enjoyed today's episode, then please make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss future episodes, and to explore some more of our content on how segmentation research is used to inform successful business outcomes, or to subscribe to our B2B Insights newsletter. Please visit B2B International's Insights Hub at b2binternational.com/insights. Thank you again, Simi. It's been great. And thanks everyone for listening.